Today we will be going over the latest letter from a priest on the crisis in the church. I previously covered his rather long letter on the de-Christianization of society and the loss of faith in the church. And he followed that up almost 2 weeks ago. I've been kind of sitting on this one because I've been kind of busy in the church, you might have noticed, with the follow-up to it. And it's on the subject of the crisis being the result of a rebellion against God by people and by the bishops and priests of the church. If you want to see what this looks like, I will show you here. Let's start with a story. I'm going to make sure I have Twitter muted. I do. Very good. So what you're seeing here is a Catholic church, which is in the Philippines, I believe. Yeah, Catholic Arena. Singer Julie Ann San Jose has issued an apology after a fundraiser in a church in which songs by ABBA and Lady Gaga were performed. Do you think an apology was needed? Yes, Catholic Arena, I do, but not necessarily by the singer. I think the parish priest and the bishop need to be the ones apologizing. But, again, it's muted because this pop songs are copyrighted, and I don't want to deal with that headache. So here she is singing and swaying and doing the rest of the stuff pop singers do in front of the tabernacle, in front of a crucifix, in front of the table altar, and all the rest of it. And the sad thing is, as ordinary foreign parishes go, just what I can see of it here, it actually looks like like the bishop and the priest had the sense to at least keep the place beautiful looking instead of excavating it. But there she is doing her pop star thing right in front of a tabernacle, which of course scandalized the faithful because of just for obvious reasons, I think. That's just one example. And then just to really blow everybody's minds here, I'll cover this maybe more in depth tomorrow, but the Pillar is reporting that Cardinal Fernandez actually did the right thing, unequivocally the right thing. See, the Vatican Secretariat of State, who is Cardinal Pietro Parolin, who is like right now at the top of the lists of people who would follow in Pope Francis's footsteps as the next pope and keep the job going that he's doing to the church. Cardinal Pietro Parolin tried to reinstate a priest who was laicized for being a Ted McCarrick kind of monster. And Cardinal Fernandez, who actually has the canonical authority over such things, stopped that process. And I got nothing to say about it. Good job, Cardinal Fernandez. Mark that one on the calendar. It's a good thing he did that unequivocally. And it really should show you what it is we're dealing with today. I use those examples as introductions for what we're talking about here with this priest. And yes, there are people doing I will say quickly, my wife gave birth to our daughter yesterday at 11:08 a.m. Central Time. We arrived at the hospital at 5, and there was like 2 other mothers giving birth at the time, so it took like 2 hours for them to even get the induction started. Mom and baby are fine. Mom and baby should be home today. So, so thank you very much for that. I posted a picture to Patreon, a subscribe star. I don't know how to safely do that for YouTube channel members. Unfortunately, I just don't know how to do it safely, and there is no chance I'm posting a picture on YouTube because that's a terrible idea for a lot of obvious reasons. But let's go to that letter from the priest. By Father Jose Maria Iraburu. This was posted to Info Católica, which I believe is Spanish originally. So if there's any syntax issues, it's because of the translation extension we're using. And he says, the headline is Churches De-Christianized, Part 2, by so many bad doctrines tolerated. Bad doctrines tolerated. Now we'll do commentary throughout this. That is the core of a lot of this. Because what are bad doctrines? Bad doctrines, meaning heresy or things that flirt with heresy, they're generally a sign of faithlessness, or at least not having the faith on the part of bishops and prelates who push this nonsense. And that's how you get a pop singer who I'll presume was born Catholic, thinking it was a good idea to do to dress like that and sing like that in a Catholic church in front of a tabernacle. It's how you get the Cardinal Secretary of State trying to take a McCarrick type priest and reinstate him. That's how you get all of those things and all the other issues we talk about here in these kinds of videos on the various channels like this on YouTube and other places. You get this stuff because those who push this stuff lack the faith in some way. They have adopted bad doctrines which undermine the faith. So here's the priest, again, commentary throughout. Fight the good fight of faith. See 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 12. This apostolic mandate is fulfilled if the truth is preached and error is challenged. But if a local church does not preach with parousia some fundamental truths of the faith, because it does not dare, for example, the mystery of salvation, the final possibility of heaven or hell, or other truths such as the grave intrinsic evil of voluntary use of artificial barriers to being fruitful and multiplying, and does not challenge serious errors that have spread with it, because it does not dare. In short, because it does not take up the cross and faithfully follow Christ, that local church advances along the wide road to perdition, or it will be a de-Christianized church. Teaching the truth, yes, but fighting error, no. John the 23rd, in his inaugural address to the Second Vatican Council, stated that the council would give a, quote, magisterium of predominantly pastoral character. However, the church wants the council to, quote, transmit the pure and integral doctrine without attenuation, which for 20 centuries it has maintained steadfastly amid so many storms. Errors have never been lacking. But, quote, the church has always opposed these errors. She has often condemned them with the gravest severity. In our time, however, the bride of Christ prefers to use the medicine of mercy rather than severity. She thinks that the needy must be helped by showing them the validity of her sacred doctrine rather than by condemning them. Citation to John the 23rd's inaugural address. The words of John the 23rd do not imply the elimination of laws and sanctions of justice in the life of church, as many as have interpreted them in the Protestant way. Luther affirmed that the law was irreconcilable with the gospel and proclaimed sola gratia as a principle. He falsely claimed what St. Paul said, Christ has redeemed us from the curse of the law. But the apostle was obviously referring to the laws of the Old Testament. In fact, the church gave itself laws from the beginning at the Council of Jerusalem, see Acts 15. And in fact, Vatican II affirms the apostolic authority of pastoral government, of the spiritual power to bind and loose with laws and norms, as one of the triplex munis of the prophetic, priestly, and royal office exercised in persona Christi. Citations to 3 Vatican II documents. Unpunished dissent against the teachings of the magisterium. I use the word dissent because it was the one used about Humanae Vitae. Excuse me. But it was used as a euphemism to avoid stronger words. Rebellion, disobedience, resistance, which would be the proper ones. Now let's pause here. He's talking about Humanae Vitae, the one document from the post-conciliar era that unequivocally everybody seems to love. Even though, if you actually look at the ends of marriage as defined in Humanae Vitae, Paul VI inverts what's said by Pius XI in Casti Connubii, which is the Humanae Vitae was, I think, an unnecessary document. It could have been a single page that gives a brief summary of Casti Connubii, which was written 30 years earlier, solemnly reaffirms everything said there, and then talks about the subject about why we all love Humanae Vitae, and gotten it right. And it would have been a fine document. It would have also been better if Paul VI actually used papal infallibility to object to the practices here. But he's talking here about this because Humanae Vitae was famously rejected by many bishops. Many bishops, including most famously the Canadian bishops, told their followers, oh, you don't need to listen to that document. The Pope doesn't know what he's talking about. They told them that. And many Catholics in practice ignore Humanae Vitae today. Paul VI, in any case, took the path of tolerated dissent. In teaching the truth and in refuting errors, he always showed with great force his apostolic teaching authority. But on the other hand, he largely restrained that authority when it came to correcting or sanctioning the erring ones, who continued to spread their lies, sometimes in serious matters, such as against Humanae Vitae. He did what John the 23rd advised, preferring to use the medicine of mercy rather than the severity of justice. John Paul II considered that the aforementioned intentions of John the 23rd, less justice, more mercy, are a, quote, golden principle dictated by the council. Now, this is John Paul II repeating what John the 23rd said and saying it's a golden principle dictated by the council, that we focus so much on mercy and not justice. With a citation to something called Tertio Millennio Adviennante, paragraph 35. The phrase sounds good, but is nothing more than a joke. Phrases like this and merciful tolerances that were not punitive in the manner of Paul VI brought very bad consequences, such as absenteeism at Sunday Mass or the widespread practice of artificial barriers to having kids in marriage. Pure, tolerated dissent. Every society requires a government and laws to have unity, order, and healthy coexistence. The Church, a human divine society, also does so, see Lumen Gentium 8. But laws, if they are not accompanied by the corresponding sanctions for their infringement, are not laws at all. They are advice or directives, nothing more. A law without sanction is against nature. Christ founded the Church with apostolic bishops, giving them power and mission to bind or loose, see Matthew chapter 16, verse 19, and 18, verse 18. Establishing just laws that are beneficial for the community and for the Christian. Shortly after the Second Vatican Council, and after many discussions among theologians about the legality of those artificial barriers, Paul VI, with great fortitude, ignoring the main advisory commission established for this purpose, and adhering to a minor commission led by Father Zalba S.J., published the encyclical Humanae Vitae, prohibiting those uses in the marital union, and also reminding people that such marital activities outside of holy matrimony are forbidden. Thus, really, in practice, prohibiting the use of these barriers for Catholics, because you're not supposed to be doing those things outside of marriage either. This doctrine, often expounded by the magisterium, is founded on the inseparable connection that God has willed and that man cannot break on his own initiative between the two meanings of the conjugal act, the unitive meaning and the procreative meaning. That's a quote from Humanae Vitae. Voluntary making the conjugal act basically sterile by physical or chemical means is to contradict the nature of man and woman and their most intimate relations, and for that reason it is also to contradict God's plan and his will. The explosion of reactions against the encyclical was enormous, persistent, and had very serious consequences for the unity of the Church, obedience to the Pope, and fidelity to constant Catholic doctrines. And there continued to be dissident resistance, more silent but more effective and tolerated, against Humanae Vitae. Faced with this terrible situation, John Paul II published the encyclical Veritatis Splendor, dedicated the last part to the defense of the intrinsically evil in moral terms, and specifically quoted and confirmed the doctrine of Humanae Vitae. Now here is John Paul II trying to very peacefully respond to those who reject the Church's teaching on such things. Quote, on intrinsically evil acts, and referring to those artificially barrier-type practices by which the conjugal act is intentionally made unfruitful, Paul VI teaches, in truth, if it is sometimes licit to tolerate lesser evil in order to avoid a greater evil or to promote a greater good, it is not licit, even for the very grave reasons, to do evil in order to achieve good. That is to make the object of a positive act of will that which is intrinsically disordered, and therefore unworthy of the human person, even if one were to safeguard or promote the good of the individual family or society. In 2024, 37 years after Veritatis Splendor, the rejection of Humanae Vitae persists, and in fact this bad tolerance by action or omission is here to stay among a large part of bishops and preachers, moralists and confessors. It is undoubtedly one of the persistent evils that leads the Church to de-Christianization. Among the first resistances that Paul VI suffered against Humanae Vitae, he pointed out three. Okay, hold on. If you wonder why the Church is becoming de-Christianized and more secular, it's because the bishops ignored Humanae Vitae, and because the laity ignored Humanae Vitae. That's why. At least that's according to him. I would add the heresy of modernism, which fuels all this stuff anyway. It's a witch's brew together of heresy and heterodox praxis, right? Anyway, so the most serious opposition of several national episcopates, such as those of Western Germany, Austria, Belgium, Canada, Scandinavia, France, Holland, Indonesia, England, and Wales, and a country that no longer exists anymore. In such a serious hour, they accepted the encyclical doctrinally, either clearly or reluctantly, but resisted it pastorally. Much more numerous, of course, were the episcopates that accepted Humanae Vitae, seeing it a continuation of the continuous tradition of the modern encyclicals on marriage. According to reliable witnesses, Paul VI was deeply affected by the scandalous resistance to the encyclical Humanae Vitae on the part of famous moralists and even national episcopates. In fact, in the 5 years preceding the encyclical Humanae Vitae, he published 6 encyclicals, and he did not publish any more in the following 10 years, and that is true. After Humanae Vitae, he stopped basically writing. Incredible. The case of Bernard Hadding After Humanae Vitae, a month and a half later, the German Redemptorist Bernard Haring published a general call to resist the papal encyclical, considering it unacceptable. It is worth remembering that before the encyclical, this professor was one of the most prestigious moralist authors, and that in his most widely distributed work, The Law of Christ, he had taught that the use of the artificial barriers used by men profanes conjugal relations, according to St. Augustine. There's no conjugal love there, since the woman is debased to the condition of a woman who receives payment for such activities. But the wind has changed, and he calls for rebellion against this doctrine. Quote, quoting this heretic, if the Pope deserves admiration for his courage in following his conscience and taking in Humanae Vitae, a totally unpopular decision, every responsible man and woman must show some similar sincerity and courage of conscience. The arguments adduced are simply unacceptable. What is needed now in the church is for everyone to speak out without hesitation, with all frankness, against these reactionary forces. End quote. Let's pause here again. That I could totally take that quote about any issue traditional Catholics stand up against the modernists about and use that as to fill in the blank from something that Bishop Botzing in Germany would say, or Pastor Jimmy Martin would say, or Cardinal Hollerich would say, or Cardinal Fernandez would say. And it would work for literally anything. Let's keep going. He was one of the first and most influential authors to announce the good news to the church and especially to theologians. It is now possible to dissent from pontifical magisterium in the church without suffering canonical sanctions, even if the Pope proclaims in an encyclical a doctrine that has always been taught by the church. As we see in his own person and conduct, he taught the liberating truth of this good news. I'd put good news in quotes because good news is just a modern word for gospel. In fact, he remained a successful dissident until his passing, retiring in 1987 as a professor at the Alphonsine Academy in Rome. And he still had the courage in readers to attack John Paul II's encyclical Veritatis Splendor, which in the last part of the document gives a complete doctrinal teaching on the intrinsically evil, applying it especially to the doctrine of the encyclical Humanae Vitae. No one knows, Haring assures Urbi et Orbi, that, quote, Peter was given the mission of instructing his brothers about an absolute norm, which prohibits in all cases any type of these artificial barriers. He said that to the tablet in 1993. Undaunted. Although in reality there was nothing to discourage him, because the rejection of Humanae Vitae, advocated by many others, continued to grow year after year at that time, and thus his personal teaching prestige increased. He was certainly a successful dissident, highly esteemed and favored. Honors and awards showered him from all sides. His Redemptorist brothers honored his passing as befitted the leading moralist of the 20th century. To the liturgical funeral rites and numerous laudatory lectures and writings, they added a large memorial on a monographic website in which gently included Johann Pachelbel's elegant Canon D in major as background music. God have him in his glory. If I'm amazed that they did that they practically canonized it, but then again, it's the post-conciliar era where suddenly you go to a Catholic funeral and you're practically watching, in many cases, what feels like a canonization process instead of an actual funeral, where the priest will be dressed in white instead of the traditional black of a funeral mass. And he'll, at his homily, be talking about how they're up in heaven now and all this other stuff, instead of telling you to pray for the repose of the soul of the person in question. The Catholic University of Washington published a rejection of the encyclical similar to that of Haring, headed by Father Charles Curran, S.J., that's not surprising, and supported by some 200 theologians. Not a few theologians and associations also publicly resisted the teaching of Pope Paul VI. A particularly famous case was that of the Washington Group. We know the story of the Washington Group well from the book by John Paul II's biographer, George Weigel, The Courage to be Catholic. He relates that the local archbishop, Cardinal O'Boyle, decided to sanction 19 priests with various penalties depending on their statements against Humanae Vitae. Those affected appealed to Rome, and the Congregation for the Clergy ordered that the archbishop to lift the sanctions without requiring those sanctions to first retract. I'm going to pause here again. The Jesuits, the modern Jesuits who are not really Jesuits, they're something else, have been in control of the Roman Curia for decades. Benedict XVI once famously told, maybe it was Father Nicholas Gruner or somebody in his orbit, when they had a face-to-face meeting with him, why he doesn't do things about the Ted McCarrick problem. And he pointed famously to his office door and said, that is where my authority ends. Because the Jesuits had control of the Roman Curia. you could see it right here where John Paul II tried to do something, as did the local as did some of the other authorities in like the local dioceses, about something about priests who taught against the words of the Pope. And his own Roman Curia worked against him and overrode the Pope's wishes on this. That's remarkable. And it should tell you everything you need to know about the nature of the crisis in the church and why a moderate Pope coming next will not do a thing to fix this. Let's continue. He acted thus, it seems, on the orders of Paul VI. The Pope was evident willing to tolerate dissent, and that's part of the problem, on the subject of Humanae Vitae, in the hope that a day would come when, in a calmer cultural and ecclesiastical atmosphere, the true teaching could be appreciated. I seem to remember that one or more than 19 illustrious opponents of the encyclical were later consecrated bishops. That was one of the beginnings, one of many, of a tolerated dissent, a new direction shown by the Holy See in the tradition of the pastoral government of the Catholic Church. Tolerated dissent, by the way, you've noticed, tolerated dissent only goes one way. Would you characterize what Pope Francis has done to Cardinal Burke, Bishop Strickland, the Bishop Fernandez out of Puerto Rico, and the others who rejected the things he was doing? Would you call that tolerated dissent? I would not. Tolerated dissent goes one way. So again, why so many of your better bishops have largely gone silent and haven't spoken up much at all about what's going on at the Synod right now. The Second Vatican Council maintained the authority, the laws, and the sanctions. He was simply being faithful to the teaching of the tradition of the church, founded on the teaching of Christ in the gospel. Communicate this to the church, and if he despises the church, let him to be you as a Gentile or a tax collector, or St. Paul. If anyone preaches to you a gospel other than that you have received, let him be accursed. Do not associate with anyone who bears the name of a brother, meaning Christian, but is immoral in matters of the flesh or covetous. Do not eat with such, and that means do not receive communion with them. In the 20th century of tradition, the church has severely sanctioned grave faults against the doctrine of faith and morals, as well as against the liturgy. Now, according to the golden principle of the council, certainly non-existent, it generally omits the sanctions that canon law prescribes for such defaults, which often go unpunished. Let us think, for example, of the frequent profanations of the new Mass, when the celebrant does not adhere to the sacred norms of the sacred rite, preferring his ideas and tastes in text and gestures. It is an attack on the heart of the Church, the Eucharist, because it desacralizes its celebration, subjecting it to his arbitrariness. And for that very reason, it is an abuse that has encouraged many faithful to distance themselves from the Mass, a very important step towards a de-Christianized Church. The tolerance shown by the Holy See regarding public, serious, and especially scandalous dissent, such as, for example, those of the Episcopal conferences, Herring and Washington, taught bishops, theologians, rectors of educational centers, as well as religious superiors, that from then on tolerated dissent should be applied in such cases, and not the demanding norms of canon law, the one promulgated by John Paul II in 1983 being in force, which modified the previous one from 1917. Norms such as this one. So here are some places that are just not enforced anymore. Canon 1365. Whoever outside the case dealt with in Canon 1364, subsection 1, teaches a doctrine condemned by the Roman pontiff or by an ecumenical council, or persistently rejects the doctrine described in Canon 750, subsection 2, or in Canon 752, and having been admonished by the Holy See or by the ordinary, does not retract, is to be punished with censure and deprivation of office. To these sanctions may be added others, enumerated in Canon 1336, etc. I can think of one really high-profile Catholic Jesuit priest in the United States who teaches a doctrine condemned by the pontiffs and by ecumenical councils and persistently rejects the doctrines received in canon law and should be punished because he refuses to retract. He is supposed to be censured and deprived of his office, meaning he's essentially supposed to, yes, he's a priest, but he can't do anything priestly until he repents. I can think of one, can you? I'm thinking, of course, of Pastor Jimmy Martin of the Jesuit Church. Because how much of this is tolerated dissent and how much of this is essentially the Vatican allowing this dissent to move the needle of where Catholic doctrine is, using the excuse that the laity demand changes, and who are we to say no to the movement of the Spirit? Needless to say, many theologians and preachers learned to point that dissent from the magisterium, Humanae Vitae, and on other issues, was not going to be sanctioned by the justice of canonical norms, but would be tolerated by the mercy of the Holy Church, mother and teacher. That's a veiled reference to John the 23rd, mother and teacher. He had a papal encyclical, his famous encyclical Mater et Magistra, mother and teacher, which is about the church as mother and teacher. And it is really the pivot point for how the church went from the pre-conciliar, justice and mercy, rigidity, and all the rest that we all long to have back to what it is now. That is the pivot point, that document. I suggest you read it if you want to. I don't read documents on this channel from the conciliar popes unless it's explicitly about something going on in the church today. But I suggest reading Mater et Magistra. It'll really open your eyes. As the years went by along these wide roads, certain progressive churches liberally arrived at the most complete de-Christianization, as was to be expected. The enormous growth of dissent, which in some churches was predominating over orthodoxy, meaning dissent was being triumphant over the actual faith, was to be expected. It is understandable. It was to be expected by groups called by some, quote, traditionalists, inditris, retrogrades, here's quoting Pope Francis, who always seek security in dogmas and norms, bound to the letter, not to the spirit, enemies of pluralism. In short, closed, unpresentable people. That is one of Pope Francis's most biting insults to people like those watching this channel right now. In progressive churches, adverse tolerance of laws and sanctions is a positive note for the most important appointments. Bishop, dean, rector, having had, quote, conflicts with the congregation of the faith, the former holy office. That'd be in reference to under Ratzinger, who tried to actually enforce the laws to some degree. In these ecclesiastical contexts, a parish priest, for example, who dared to openly preach, among many other things, the divinity of Jesus Christ, the existence of the devil and hell, the intrinsically evil nature of the use of those barriers in marriage, and other such extremes, however wise, charitable, good, and beloved by his parishioners, he might be clearly showed himself to be unfit for a higher pastoral ministry. Here the sanitary line is necessary. But on the contrary, tolerant fidelity to dissident progressivism, according to its devotees, is the best insurance for maintaining the peaceful unity of the church. God willing, in the next article, I will present a varied sample of famous or lesser famous dissidents, widely privileged, and I will bring that to you here in the coming days, probably on the weekend. Tolerated dissent, privileged dissent, persecuted orthodoxy. It's a logical process. Hard times, as St. Teresa would say. Hard times when full fidelity to Catholic orthodoxy is often an unfavorable condition for teaching in a seminary and a faculty of theology, for assuming the ministry of bishop, etc. Let us be realistic. To introduce into a seminary, faculty, diocese, or other areas of the church that are clearly dominated by tolerated or even privileged dissent, as there are so many, is to introduce into that center a device of destruction, because it is foreseeable that it will be the occasion of very unpleasant incidences at any moment. There must be in the candidate introduced a sufficient degree of tolerance towards dissent, that these are the norms we live under now, which will sometimes have to be the same towards heresy. Those who do not know how to restrain themselves and remain silent in the face of serious doctrinal deviations, in the face of violations of important norms of the church, do not contribute to the peace or to the unity of any center, and these are the primary goods of the church. They must be properly watched and controlled, and in serious conflict situations, the expulsion of such separating elements or the prudent application of a cordon sanitaire, that means hiding them away from everybody else, cannot be excluded, since above all it is necessary to maintain the church in her condition as one. Jesus gave his life for the people, that he might gather into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. He's quoting statements from these figures, right? And these, in their statements about why the church is governed the way it is now, they use scripture to justify allowing unscriptural, un-Catholic teachings to persist in the church in the post-conciliar era. More, the internal tensions and conflicts in the church are not caused by those who are tolerant of dissidents, but by unbridled resistors, essentially by people like you and I. We are the cause of the internal tension, according to their logic. Paul VI preached quite frequently against the invasion of lies by the devil. Sin is the occasion and effect of an intervention in us and in the world of a dark and hostile agent, the devil. And on the occasion of a great solemnity, He said something else, although in very mild terms. He declared that he felt that through some fissure the smoke of Satan had entered the temple of God. In reality, more than smoke and fissure, is a great fire of the father of lies, achieved with the very temple of God, which is the church. John Paul II gravely warns, as if surprised and alarmed, that, quote, in the church, ideas contrary to revealed truth have been spread with open hands and taught since time immemorial. True heresies have been propagated in the dogmatic and moral field, creating doubts, confusion, and rebellion. Even the liturgy has been manipulated, immersed in intellectual and moral relativism, and thus in permissiveness. Christians are tempted by atheism, agnosticism, a vaguely moralistic enlightenment, by a sociological Christianity, without defined dogmas and without objective morality. And one wonders, how could this invasion of evil have been possible? Or rather, how could this degradation of orthodoxy not occur if errors were not sufficiently curbed and erring people were not properly punished? Benedict XVI is also very sensitive to the spread of major errors within the church. At Fatima, he declared, the greatest persecution that the church suffers does not come from external enemies, but is born from the sin of the church. In our time and vast regions of the earth, faith is in danger of being extinguished like a flame that is extinguished. How could this be? If the seed sown in the field was good, while the guardians of the field slept, an enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. It was later seen that the field produced a mixture of wheat and weeds, and in time, more weeds than wheat. Consent and privileged dissent in a church is a broad road that undoubtedly leads to a de-Christianized church. No special research, a monographic symposium, or the help of private revelation are needed to point out the historical necessity of this progressive degradation. You don't need to be paying attention to Marian apparitions at all to note that the church is in crisis and becoming secularized, because all you have to do is be familiar vaguely at all with the history of these topics in the post-conciliar era and to see how we got here. You don't need Our Lady warning us at La Salette that this was coming, though it's very good that she did warn us of that, and I will continue to bring those messages to you to try to drive the point home. The Anglican community has fallen into decline. Now, when I read this a couple days ago, I thought this was a very interesting section, because I will tell you right now, it really does look that the synodalists want to turn the Catholic Church into the Anglican communion with a symbolic pope, who is the sign of unity. But beyond that, all things are off. The subject is vast and complex. Breviter, among all the separated brethren, meaning schismatics in the post-conciliar period, the love of euphemisms is notable. The Anglican communion was traditionally the closest to the Catholic Church in doctrine, worship, and spiritual quality. That is why it is very sad to see that over the centuries it was clearly declining. In the writings of Newman especially, this sad decline is described and diagnosed. This brought about the fact that in the 19th and 20th centuries, a good number of Anglicans went over to the Catholic Church. I recall only a few of the best-known personalities. Cardinal Newman, Archdeacon Robert Wilberforce, James Hope, and Henry Manning, and the priest Ronald Knox, whose writings I bring to you periodically, Bishop Graham Leonard, and many others to this day. All of them, in increasing numbers, have requested to be received into the Catholic Church for the same reason, because they did not accept the tolerance of dissent that had taken hold in the Anglican communion. Great extremes of tolerance had been reached in the case of incompatible convictions, and even in the case of certain heresies, on the virginity of Mary, the physical reality of the resurrection of Christ, divorce, adultery, the sacrifice to Moloch, evangelizing zeal curbed by respect for religions, women priests and bishops, etc. They no longer saw it possible to live the Christian life in Anglicanism. The Catholic Church was presented to them as the only place where, with the grace of God, the gospel of Christ the Savior could be fully lived. Quoting one of these figures, if I remember correctly, I read in a long biography of Newman that on one occasion, after the Eucharist, he saw the attendants throwing away the leftover consecrated bread in the usual manner. That this is one of the main blows he received from Anglicanism that made him abandon it definitively. Certain solemnities and elegant celebrations are maintained, to which the English are traditionally addicted. It is very notable, especially after Chesterton, the great number of English writers who flourished in the Catholic Church in the 20th century, with Robert Hugh Benson, Chesterton, Belloc, Knox, Evelyn Waugh, Tolkien, Graham Greene. The Anglican communion at the time was declining in all aspects: in orthodoxy, internal unity, doctrine, morals, and worship. Many temples empty or closed, number of faithful and pastors, little Christian religiosity in the family, and a great decrease in missionary zeal, previously considerable. Something similar can happen to the Catholic churches that have emphasized tolerance of doctrinal and disciplinary dissent from the universal church, the only bride of Christ. These are churches in which dissent occurs even on various serious issues and is tolerated and privileged, not fought. It is logical that this degradation occurs in them if they do not seek to preserve the unity of the church, but the unity of all humanity in a universal fraternity. That is a direct statement against Pope Francis. In such a diabolical attempt, it is rather orthodoxy and orthopraxy that are persecuted or simply despised and ignored, as is well said in Mexico. God willing, in the next article, I will show the reality of this situation with concrete examples. We seek refuge under your protection, Holy Mother of God, glorious and blessed Virgin. Signed, Jose Maria Iraburu, priest. A long letter, but he's not wrong about any of it. Let's take a look here. Traditionalist Catholic says, didn't St. Pius X say something about popular music not being allowed in church? Yes. He actually wrote some pretty hard to accept things about proper liturgical music. Before the council, pianos were apparently not even allowed in parishes. These days, if you see a piano and the music is reasonably solemn sounding, you breathe a sigh of relief at most parishes instead of, them busting out the Hillsong United or whatever nonsense. Traditionalist Catholic Anglican community looks to become a political church. I mean, that's what it is. And that's where they're trying to take us in the Catholic Church too. The TLMS I attend used to have a pastor who converted as an Anglican priest. Many such cases. Many such cases. All right. For those who are joining us late, because I'm going to wrap this up here, I will just say that, yes, my wife gave birth to our child yesterday, for those who might be curious. Happened about 11 o'clock in the morning, and mom and baby are doing fine. Her name is Claire now, and she'll be, mom and baby will be home today, hopefully, unless the nurse, her doctor changes her mind today. So any thoughts in the comments before we wrap this up? Ravenmer talks about mentions the Oxford movement. Yeah, I mean, Newman came out of that. I think Chesterton kind of sort of did too. In the late 19th into the mid 20th century, the Catholic Church got all the best minds from Anglicanism. It really, really, really did. It really did. And people, of course, are, giving best wishes for the birth of our daughter, which is appreciated. Anyway, folks, thanks very much for tuning in today. And Bleach Demon says, the collapse of the Anglican Communion is part of why I'm converting now to Catholicism. Good. Get to a traditional parish if you can. Or if you've got an Anglican ordinariate parish in your area, which there aren't very many of those, get to one of those. But otherwise, get to a traditional parish if you can, just because that's where you're going to find things most stable, I say. All right, folks, thanks very much for tuning in. And as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.